Ray, are
And
you
we are
there?
recording.
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry.
Awesome.
All right,
Okay,
Cool.
go for it.
so my topic was geothermal energy. And so just a quick overview of how that works is that Earth's core is molten, obviously. It's really hot. It's actually near the temperature of the sun. And a lot of that thermal energy radiates outward towards the surface. And so what geothermal energy does is it is using that thermal energy, that heat, um, to generate power as a renewable in a renewable way. So one of the most common ways of generating this power would be to drill down, and the depth that you drill depends on the location you're at. But you drill down, you can pump water uh, down into the ground where you drilled. The heat from the core heats up the water. You keep the water pressurized while it's heat, then you send the water back up to the surface. You depressurize it, and the water vaporizes, and then that water vapor spins a turbine, and that turbine generates electricity. So one of the major benefits of this is that it's renewable, which is what our whole site is about. Earth's core is not cooling down anytime soon. And in my research, I came across a little fact that said that Earth would be swallowed by the sun before Earth's core could even harden, which is really cool. Um, Another benefit of that, of geothermal energy, is that it emits 99% less carbon dioxide and 97% less acid rain causing sulfur compounds compared to fossil fuel power plants of similar sizes. So those are some of the benefits. And then one of the there are various disadvantages of geothermal energy, but I thought as far as ethics is concerned, the most interesting one would be the possible like determinant of nature. So oftentimes we only have the technology to harness this geothermal energy at volcanic sites, and as a society we cherish these sites. For example, Yellowstone National Park. It's protected, and that would be a perfect site for what's called a dry steam power plant, but it's protected, so we can't use or build a geothermal power plant there. So just kind of controversial as whether or not we should destroy these naturally occurring volcanic sites that we deem beautiful in order to produce power.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Dylan, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. So my topic was hydropower or hydroelectric power or hydroelectricity. All of those terms are kind of interchangeable. And this is actually one of the oldest forms of renewable energy we've been able to harvest, just because for millennia people have used it to power mills, and like sewing and wheat mills. And recently, in the past century or so, dams, large dams such as the Hoover Dam in Nevada and Bunch in China and Canada worldwide, uses the potential energy of water that is flowing downstream, and that water is pooled up to create more and more potential energy, and then it is slowly trickled down through the dam, which then powers turbines, so that potential energy becomes kinetic, which then moves the turbines generating electricity. Dams are the most common form of hydroelectric power, but there is another one where it's you take a river and divert it to another source, and that diverted power will then push a turbine. So you're not making a pool and then dropping it, you're actually creating just another offshoot of the river. Um, and there is a third source that is much less common, um, but that it also it involves pooling water at the bottom, and you basically shoot it back up through a dam or a facility to create that potential energy and then drop it back down for kinetic. So it all has to do with gravity. One of the main benefits of hydroelectric power is it just has to do with how water moves naturally. Gravity, the rivers are already there, and they can run constantly. It's not like wind or solar where sometimes the weather really depends on how you can use it. The rivers are always running, and unless everything dries up, which it doesn't look like is going to happen anytime soon, the hydroelectric power is there. It's also already the most widespread use of clean energy in the world that is changing as we get better at solar and nuclear. But it's because it is the oldest and it was the easiest to harness at the time. So it's already very widespread across the globe, especially China is the largest producer, and then it is Canada, Brazil, and then the US. So we're not even the largest producer of hydropower. One of the major drawbacks is how much it costs, both money wise and for carbon, to build these facilities. If we're talking about large dams, they cost a lot of money, they take a long time to build, and all of the energy used to build it is usually fossil fuels because of how our construction is built. It's concrete, it's bringing in electronics, metals, and all of this stuff that costs a lot of energy to build. Now, ultimately, a dam that's been around for 80 years has made up for that. But it is a drawback to building new dams just because of how much it costs, and we don't really know if we can allow that much carbon tax to happen. Another major drawback is, especially with the larger dams, you do very much alter the environment around it. There's been a growing push, especially from native tribes in the western United States, to tear down dams because of how they disrupt natural fish migrations and fish populations. Just because when you build it, you're creating a new lake at the bottom and then you're drying up a lot of the river directly below the dam. And if the dam is not maintained properly and it breaks, suddenly you have another complete drastic change in environment, which can affect and kill not just animals but also people, because we've started to build societies downriver from dams, and if that dam floods, you've just wiped out basically an entire town. So there's just a lot of ethical considerations there of it really does affect the environment, sometimes positively, but almost always negatively. However, it's already so widespread that the biggest arguments are, should we really destroy the dams we have now or just stop building new ones? And there are certain countries such as Korea are still building new ones, and certain countries such as the US are starting to tear some of their dams down or shift more towards smaller dams that really only power a single community, as opposed to huge ones like the Hoover Dam that power multiple cities. So it's very clean, it's very usable, it's already widespread, but it costs a lot, and it can harm both animal and human life if done improperly or not managed correctly.
Very nice. I'll jump in next. My topic was solar energy. And essentially, I'm sure you guys all know how solar energy works. It comes from the sun. Obviously, renewable energy, because the sun is not going anywhere, not for a very, very long time. So it's kind of the easiest and most prominent source of energy that we're all constantly interacting with. So if solar cells or someone could figure out how to harness that solar energy, we could realistically have energy till the end of time, or as long as humans are on Earth anyway. So the way that solar energy harnessing works essentially is you build a solar cell, which is kind of small. It's usually about essentially like a piece of paper almost. The sizes of them can vary, but typically solar cells are smaller units that get linked up with other solar cells to create whole solar modules, eventually creating whole solar panels. These panels receive the light that comes from the sun. The light photons hit the solar panel, and through that contact, it generates electricity through dislodged electrons that get knocked out of place within the solar panel, that get diverted to a generator, and then is then used for energy. So as Dylan said, the most common sort of wrinkle with solar panels is that the sun isn't shining all the time every day. If it's nighttime or if it's cloudy outside, I know Dylan's from the Pacific Northwest, it rains a lot. You don't get a lot of sunlight there. So sometimes it might not be as effective as other places like in LA, where the sun is always shining. So there's a little bit of that wrinkle that makes it a little bit difficult to make it widespread and to make it just sort of universal across the world to use solar panels, because the sun isn't always shining. But there have been recent developments in the way solar energy is generated, known as distributed generation, where essentially if you create a network of solar panels and solar generation modules big enough, then excess energy that gets built up in one city or in one area can be distributed across a local community, uh, and even beyond that, because once the energy is generated, it's just there. You can use it for whatever you need to use it for. So in order to divert that energy to a place that might not be able to be as reliant on solar power, or it might be inconvenient for them to build a bunch of solar panels, in order to save any carbon emissions that get emitted because of burning of fossil fuels or anything. You can use this distributed generation process to transmit and transfer excess solar energy that gets generated from one city to a different city. That's just a minor workaround that people have been using recently to improve the efficiency of solar panel generation. But however, the big drawbacks still are that it's not very efficient. The most effective solar panels only reach about like 46% efficiency. So only 46% of the light that's actually hitting the solar panel can be converted into electricity. And then again, from using that electricity, transforming it into something that we can use in our houses, in our buildings, to charge our phones, charge our computers, whatever it is, there's a little bit more energy that gets lost in conversion once the solar panel actually takes and captures that energy. Another big drawback is that solar modules can be extremely expensive. Even just a residential house, like a upper middle class solar panel module could cost upwards of $20,000. Depending on the size of your house, depending on the size of the module you're trying to get, they can get extremely expensive. This tends to be offset by the fact that when you buy a house, you tend to live in that house for a while. So if you get a solar module earlier on in the process, after a decade or so, it would pay itself off. But the high sticker price and just the length of time that you need to be committed to a solar module does make it a little bit complicated for the widespread use of solar panels. Ethically, there is a little bit of a difference with solar panels than hydroelectric or geothermal, or as Ray's going to talk about, nuclear energy, because solar panels are much more widely accessible. They sort of concentrate the focus of the ethical dilemma onto the individual, which can make it a little bit more complicated because you're no longer making decisions about how you're affecting the grand environment around you, because you're not trying to drill into a volcano like Tayden said. You're not trying to disrupt natural fish markets or fish migration like Dylan said. You're just putting some silicon on top of your house. So because of that, because of how individual these actions can be, there is the temptation to sort of slack and consider the installation of solar panels as no longer an ethical concept because it's just one person. Like, what can one person do? But in the grander scheme of things, when a bunch of people all get solar panels, that's so much carbon emissions that get saved. That's so many fossil fuels that don't get burned, so many resources that we don't deplete from the earth. And it does kind of become a question of how much is the individual responsible for taking care of the environment.
Cool stuff.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah. So my topic was about nuclear energy, and nuclear energy is one of the biggest forms of clean energy, primarily because it can produce so much power with so little material. But essentially, with how nuclear energy works, it uses the concept of fission, which is the splitting of atoms to generate energy, most commonly used with uranium. And with this fuel, the uranium is mined, it's enriched to make it more potent. It's formed into pellets to make it to make it more usable, and then those are placed into control rods and are then placed into the nuclear reactors to be used for fuel. Nuclear energy and nuclear reactors essentially work by splitting uranium atoms apart, creating a chain reaction that generates heat, generates energy up to around 500 degrees Fahrenheit to essentially boil water. That steam that is created is transferred to a steam generator and is then created into electricity, similar to how geothermal energy might work in um, steam generation. So this fission of atoms emits heat, and pressurized water is used for that generator. There's a few pros and cons to using nuclear energy. For one, it's extremely powerful. The energy that is emitted from the splitting of atoms is immense and can power entire grids. Approximately 20% of the current US power grid is powered by nuclear energy, and that's from a very small number of nuclear reactors kind of spread across the United States. This influence expands across the world. Countries like Germany, Sweden, and the UK all use nuclear energy to an extent, and they're all extremely popular and have a lot of energy power behind them that can power the entire country. Another pro of having nuclear energy is that there's no carbon emissions, or at least no direct carbon emissions. There's no fossil fuels used in the process of creating nuclear energy, and it can produce a lot of energy and reliably at that. Any carbon emissions that might be released are always a subset of the process of creating the reactor or mining for the uranium itself. And as a result, this carbon emissions that come out from the process of nuclear energy are minimal, and it's one of the keys to eliminating global warming and climate change and all these other factors while also having a lot of clean energy. Let's see. The primary concerns with having nuclear energy are essentially safety, nuclear waste, and the cost. As we all know, about a decade ago, the tragedy of Fukushima was very present in everyone's minds, as well as tragedies like Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island in the U.S. and the I think Chernobyl's in Russia, right? um, but these kind of nuclear fallouts are always present in everyone's mind, and usually when people think of nuclear energy, um, these meltdowns as well as the stereotypical mushroom cloud from the atomic bombs are all huge concerns. However, despite popular beliefs, nuclear energy is actually incredibly safe. Um, among those three nuclear meltdowns, Chernobyl was the only one with direct or even indirect deaths as a result of the nuclear radiation. Fukushima and 3 Mile Island, they were both created with a lot of safety protocols, and as a result, no one was killed during those nuclear meltdowns. In terms of waste, nuclear waste is a very pressing concern as the radiation is very, very potent and is, as a result, has a lot of energy and can definitely kill a lot of people. However, as of right now, there's two ways to manage waste, which is containment and reprocessing. Containment is essentially storing the spent control rods and the spent nuclear pellets or the radioactive pellets and placing them in secure locations. There's a few ways of doing this. In some countries, they store them deep underground, more than 400 meters underground in concrete tanks that are supposed to last thousands of years, because that's how long it'll take until it becomes safe again. And other times they're contained in these concrete shells above ground, at least until they're safe enough to handle with enough protection. Reprocessing is another way of containing the nuclear waste. Essentially, it uses that waste, it reprocesses it into plutonium, which is also another form of energy that can be used, or it can be used for bomb grade nuclear energy. Both of these they are both expensive as well as immensely dangerous. And as a result, the U.S. has banned the use of reprocessing, but other countries around the world do reprocess their nuclear waste. The final issue is cost. It's extremely expensive to build nuclear reactors, and uranium mining is also not very cheap, as it is not a very common element, at least the radioactive version of it. Uranium 235 is very abundant, but uranium 238, which is the more radioactive brother of 235, um, is not all that common. Additionally, only 4% of the uranium that is mined is actually useful. So when the uranium is sent off to these nuclear reactors, only 4% of the control raw or only 4% of the uranium mined is actually used in the fission process. The other 96% is waste. And as a result, it's not entirely efficient, but because it produces so much energy, most people don't press that as a concern. Obviously, some of the ethical considerations of nuclear energy are the safety concerns. As I said before, whenever people think about nuclear energy, the first thing they think about is nuclear fallout or nuclear meltdowns and how that can affect the communities around them. But what's interesting is that most of these concerns are as a result of nuclear meltdowns that happens from the 70s and the late 1900s. And technology has progressed a lot since then. The only problem is that the media and the news and all this information revolving nuclear energy has not progressed as well, and people are still thinking that nuclear energy is a recipe for disaster, waiting to destroy towns and entire cities. However, as of right now, there's a lot of progress in nuclear energy technology. There's improved nuclear pellets, which would be more safe, and nuclear systems that wouldn't allow for a nuclear meltdown to happen. Um, as with Fukushima and 3 Mile Island, they happened because of power failures, and as a result, the uranium was too hot, and meltdown occurred. Um, but yeah, the biggest obstacle that nuclear energy faces is these ethical concerns of whether communities would want nuclear power despite the immense energy gains that would be gained, as well as it being immensely cheap over the long run. Um, and yeah, that's nuclear power, I suppose.
Nice. Um, so now is the time for like open uh, ethical discussion. And I want to start off because and this is more in particular to Dylan, but obviously is open up to everyone. So Dylan, I feel like uh, hydroelectricity and geothermal energy, as far as on the large scale, have some of the same ethical concerns regarding like the determinant of nature. Um, there are like for geothermal energy, there are ways that you can implement it on smaller scales. An example of this is called like geothermal heat pumps, where like individual buildings or houses could dig down, not quite as deep for like generating power, but they dig down and they can access some of that heat in the ground to heat the building. So that seemed like a safer way to go about geothermal energy. But kind of like I was saying earlier, on that large scale, um, it seems like geothermal energy would really be detrimental to like the nature that we admire. So I guess Dylan, my question is like, do we think that the intrinsic beauty or the intrinsic value of nature should overcome the the possible power we could get from nature?
So, it's a tricky question because I actually do think it's a different conversation for geothermal than hydro. Just because since hydro is more widespread, we've kind of gotten used to the way these rivers and lakes have been formed, especially with the dams. Um, and living in Washington, like a lot of the push has been in Oregon and California. If there are these dams that are really harming fish runs, but in Washington, the way we've built our dams along the Columbia is salmon runs are able to get back up over the dams. It's like a requirement to build them in Washington. So it actually doesn't harm the native fish population as much. It still alters the environment, yes, but I have seen like I still think the Columbia River is beautiful even though it has some dams in it. So the way I lean when I'm looking specific towards hydropower is I don't think we need to really get rid of a bunch of old dams. I think if they're kind of useless and they don't actually generate hydropower, yes, because some dams do exist that aren't hydropower plants. But beauty is also kind of a construct. I wrote about this a little in my paper, but wilderness is more of a mindset that the US has that I think a lot of other countries don't, which is why China, Korea, Brazil are still building hydropower, because they recognize that, yeah, it might alter the environment at first, but it doesn't completely destroy the river ecosystem. And the energy generated is so much better in the long term. So I personally am for keeping the dams we have around and actually maintaining them as opposed to knocking a bunch of ones down. I think the benefits of having more clean energy, especially from hydropower, outweigh the effects on the environment. Geothermal, I think, is a different story because I don't know how much it alters the environment.
Yeah, actually, if I could jump in here too, good points, Dylan. I liked what you said. I think in regards to Taden's question, the original question, I think with something like hydroelectric and building dams for hydroelectric power, I think in the current state that we're in, where we are in kind of a climate crisis, we're just constantly burning fossil fuels. There's so many carbon emissions in the atmosphere. I think it is sort of a fight one battle at a time. So like for now, when we still have to focus on being able to breathe in a few decades, then I think keeping the dams, or maybe following what Dylan said about like not necessarily building new ones or scrapping the ones that aren't hydroelectric, but still maintaining that source of hydroelectric power, just because we do kind of need any renewable energy we can get at this point in order to allow nature to continue on in the future. There are like some considerations about like how much we're responsible for maintaining the natural world. But I think for now, in order to, it's kind of like we're doing this in order to protect them. That is kind of, I know that's like sometimes a tricky idea, tricky concept in a lot of situations. But in this one, I do think that can apply just because if we're to truly honor and protect the natural world, we need to make sure it's still around in a few years. And if in order to do that, we need to maintain dams and hydroelectric plants and even geothermal operations potentially, then I say probably err on the side of go for it.
Hmm. Are there any oh, sorry. Dylan, are there any uses of hydroelectric power in terms of the ocean rather than rivers and lakes?
So that I actually didn't find too much on, and the reason is because it's really harnessed using potential and kinetic energy, and so rivers and waterfalls are just much more consistent than tides. Like I honestly just never saw anything about the ocean. I mean, there
Hmm.
are saltwater rivers, there are definitely a bunch of places to do it, but having that natural water flow is just so much easier to harness. If it were to be the ocean, probably a new type of facility would have to be built, or the one where it's the facility itself creates the potential energy.
Got it. Interesting.
Yeah, because it would affect the environment a lot less if it was in the middle of the ocean, but also that would be a lot harder to build because it's deeper. I wish we could harness the ocean for hydroelectricity. That would power so much.
Mm. I guess it would be also difficult because I didn't think about how the electricity will get back to shore.
Yeah.
That's true. Yeah. Mm.
I had a oh, Tayden, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was gonna ask you a
Yeah.
question
Oh,
actually.
go for it. Go for it.
So you said that one of the only disadvantages right now of solar energy is like the cost
Mm.
of building or setting up the solar energy for individual homes. So I was wondering if you came across um, any ways that people have suggested mitigating that cost, or if you yourself have thought of possible ways to mitigate that cost. I'm asking because the cost you gave, you said like between 10 and 20,000 was around the same cost for like an individual home to put a geothermal heat pump in to replace their own heating and cooling system. So
Yeah. Yeah, so there are it's very state county dependent, but they like local governments do provide subsidies. They do provide financial assistance to people that do want to install solar panels on their house or in their office building or whatever it is. Um, it does vary a lot because depending on your state, depending on your political culture, there is a little bit of like, I like oil and I like fossil fuels, and or in like the U.S. government when companies like Exxon for lobby against solar policies and actively peddle misinformation about climate change. There is a good deal of uncertainty around how much is this actually going to help me. Um, but yeah, certain states, certain counties do provide solar subsidies. I know there's certain counties, I think in California, that do. I think in my research, I found there's like certain areas in Georgia that also allow solar subsidies to reduce that cost a little bit more. It still ends up being around a few $1,000s, so it can be tricky for people with like in lower income households that might not be able to front a few $1,000s to cut their energy costs for 20 years because they might not be there for 20 years, or they might not have the money right away to pay for the solar module. But there are certain like governmental policies in place for certain communities to better access solar energy. But yeah, this actually does kind of lead me into the thing I wanted to talk to you guys about, which was about cost. Having a massive cost is kind of a staple for all of our different kinds of clean energy, just because it's not very abundant and it is very difficult to change the status quo. So I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on how much should cost weigh into the decision about switching over to a cleaner, renewable form of energy.
Hmm. I wanted to go first with this. I think the biggest problem with that is exactly what you mentioned, that status quo, because other forms of energy that are not so renewable, like coal, petroleum, oil, and all these other things, they're also immensely expensive. But because of the sunk cost that's involved with them, and because we've been using these kinds of energies for so long and they've become normalized, we don't think about that cost as much as we do with newer forms of energy like geothermal, hydro, solar, and nuclear. Um, Particularly with nuclear energy, because so much energy can be created with such little uranium. Um, I think the cost is definitely, in fact, like worth it, just because the amount of nuclear reactors that we have, nuclear power plants that we have across the U.S. is not that many, but all of them combined make up it's almost a quarter of the entire United States power grid, which is that's a lot of homes, and that's a lot of businesses. Um, but if we can create that much power with so little power plants and reactors, then I think it's totally worth it.
Yeah, for mine, cost is interesting because the costs of building the facilities have for the most part been done in the US. I mean, in the 20s, 30s, 40s, not only did we spend the money on the dams, but also building those dams created jobs. And a lot of the pushback is like, oh, if we switch to clean energy, we're going to lose oil and coal jobs. And that's just, I don't think that's true. If anything, switching to clean energy will create more. But people still have to be hired to move the turbines, to run the dam, to repair it. And I think if hiring more people to actually maintain hydroelectric facilities would help. And if you put more money into maintaining those as opposed to maintaining oil rigs, like an oil spill is way more detrimental than a small dam burst. And dams rarely burst. They burst if they are completely neglected. So I think the cost is worth it. And for hydro, it's interesting because a lot of the cost has already been done. But putting in the money now saves the majority of people in the long run. I do think it's different than solar for both hydro and nuclear because it's more of a community cost affecting a whole community, whereas solar, I think you pointed out, tends to be very individual. So there might be a lot more economic barriers on solar power.
Yeah, I can go now. Um, Dylan, before I talk about geothermal energy, I just wanted to comment on Dylan, what he said about like losing jobs. I think like that claim that like jobs will be lost if we switch to renewable resources is very interesting because yes, those jobs in like the coal industry or like oil refinery, whatnot, those jobs will start to filter out, but they would transition to the renewable energy. So I think that's like a I think that's something that a lot of people forget to think about is like you like yeah you're getting rid of this thing, but we need other people to work these new renewable resources. And as far as geothermal energy is considered, like I said a little bit earlier with, to Jeremy, that like if an individual wanted to put their own geothermal heat pump in their home to heat and cool their home to mitigate their electricity bill, that would be around like $10,000 to $20,000. But as far as like the larger like full on power plants where you're generating electricity from geothermal energy, those can cost up like millions of dollars to put into place, which thinking about is a lot of money. But as far as like the cost of all of these renewable resources, I feel like as far as the climate is concerned, we're almost to a point where like the cost of implementing renewable resources shouldn't really matter because if we continue using fossil fuels and um, putting in greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, changing our climate, like we're not going to be able to survive, basically. So I think the cost as we continue to go down the line becomes less of an ethical factor for me.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. It's kind of like a we don't know what we're gonna do, but we know that we can do this thing, and this thing can help us. So even if it's like, even if it's expensive, even if it's a big change, even if it's taxing on us as a community, we should still do it because in the long run, it'll still help us. So yeah, great, great discussion, you guys. I hope for all the people that are watching this, I hope you all enjoyed. And feel free to come up with your own thoughts too. This is a discussion that involves all of us, not just the four people on the screen. So clean energy is continued to be talked about. It is constantly being developed, changed, added. So this discussion doesn't end here. It's very much a live, constant topic that we all should be engaged in. Any final thoughts, you guys?
Let's make the switch. I mean, that's my personal opinion, but just the benefits outweigh the drawbacks.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
I agree. And when making the switch, we need to make sure we are cognizant of little negative aspects of implementing these certain types of renewable energy. So
Oh yeah, for sure.
Nice.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, y'all.
No, thank you.